The wreckage was scattered across 3 miles of Montana wilderness, twisted metal and shattered dreams painted against the snow like a grotesque abstract painting. Flight 447 had vanished from radar at 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday night, carrying 89 souls into the void. What remained looked less like an airplane and more like God's own tantrum. Pieces of fuselage embedded in pine trees 30 feet off the ground, seats thrown like dice across frozen meadows. NTSB investigator Sarah Chen had seen her share of crashes, but this one made her skin crawl. 23 years of pulling apart aviation disasters, and she'd never encountered wreckage patterns quite like this. The debris field was wrong, scattered in perfect concentric circles, as if the plane had exploded outward from its center rather than hitting the ground. Find anything yet? Her partner, Marcus Rivera, approached with 2 steaming cups of coffee, his breath forming clouds in the bitter mountain air. Sarah held up a twisted piece of metal, examining it under her flashlight. Look at this. The fragment was covered in what appeared to be scorch marks, but they formed intricate, almost geometric patterns. This isn't burn damage from fuel ignition. This is something else entirely. The real mystery, however, lay 50 yards deeper into the forest. The flight data recorder, the infamous black box, sat perched upright on a tree stump, completely undamaged. Not a scratch on its bright orange casing. Sarah had never seen anything like it in 2 decades of crash investigations. "That's impossible," Marcus muttered, staring at the pristine device. "The impact forces alone should have buried this thing 6 feet underground." Sarah carefully lifted the recorder, surprised by how warm it felt despite sitting in sub-zero temperatures for 3 days. The moment her gloved fingers made contact, she could have sworn she heard something. A faint humming, almost like a lullaby, emanating from within the device. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" She pressed the recorder to her ear. The humming was definitely there, rhythmic and hypnotic, like a heartbeat wrapped in static. But that was impossible. Flight data recorders were purely mechanical devices. They didn't hum, they didn't generate heat, and they certainly didn't survive crashes without a single dent. "We need to get this to the lab immediately," Sarah said, fighting off a sudden wave of dizziness. The humming was getting louder, more insistent, and for just a moment, she could have sworn she heard something else buried in the sound. A voice, perhaps multiple voices, whispering words she couldn't quite make out. Marcus reached for the recorder, but Sarah pulled it away instinctively. "I'll handle it." As they walked back toward their vehicle, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Their footprints in the snow, the ones they'd made walking into the forest just 20 minutes earlier, were gone. The snow around the crash site was pristine, unmarked, as if no one had ever been there at all. She looked down at the black box cradled in her arms. The humming had stopped, but now the device felt ice cold, so cold it burned through her gloves. And in the reflection of its orange surface, she saw something that couldn't be there. The shadow of the crashed plane, intact and flying, moving across the metal like a ghost. Sarah blinked hard, but when she looked again, the reflection showed only her own terrified face staring back at her. "Marcus," she whispered, but when she turned around, her partner was nowhere to be seen. She stood alone in the forest, holding a device that defied every law of physics she knew, surrounded by wreckage from a plane that was beginning to look less and less like any aircraft she'd ever investigated. And in the distance, barely audible above the wind, she heard the unmistakable sound of jet engines approaching through the night sky. The NTSB facility in Denver buzzed with activity, but Sarah felt isolated in her sterile examination room, staring at the black box that had consumed her thoughts for 3 sleepless days. She'd run every test in the book: X-rays, spectrographic analysis, electromagnetic field readings. The results were consistently impossible. The device appeared to be standard issue, a Honeywell flight data recorder manufactured in 2019. But the readings showed internal components that didn't exist in any aircraft system. crystalline structures where there should be circuit boards, organic compounds where there should be silicon chips. And the temperature readings were erratic, sometimes 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, exactly human body temperature. Dr. Chen, her assistant David, peered through the glass partition. The audio playback equipment is ready. Sarah nodded, though every instinct screamed at her to walk away. She'd been avoiding this moment, the actual analysis of the flight's final minutes. In her experience, cockpit voice recordings were either routine chatter or screams of terror. But something told her Flight 447 would be different. She slipped on her headphones and started the playback. At first, only static. Then, gradually, voices emerged from the white noise. Flight control, this is Flight 447. We're experiencing some unusual turbulence up here. Captain Morrison's voice sounded calm, professional. Sarah fast-forwarded through routine communications, searching for the moment everything went wrong. She found it at timestamp 23:41:15. "What the hell is that?" First Officer Williams's voice cracked with fear. Jesus Christ, are you seeing this?" Morrison's composure shattered. Sarah leaned forward. In the background, she could hear something else, that same humming she'd noticed in the forest, but louder now, more complex. It sounded almost musical, like a choir singing in a language that didn't exist. "Flight 447, please state your emergency," came the air traffic controller's voice. But Morrison wasn't responding to the tower anymore. "The passengers," he whispered. "Look at the passengers." "They're not moving," Williams replied, his voice barely audible. "None of them are moving, but their eyes, God, their eyes are all open." The humming intensified, and Sarah realized she could almost understand it now, almost make out words hidden in the melody. She turned up the volume, ignoring David's concerned knocking on the glass partition. "The instruments are going crazy," Morrison continued. "Altitude showing negative numbers, compass is spinning, and the temperature, it says it's 98.6 degrees outside the aircraft." Sarah's blood turned to ice. 98.6 degrees, body temperature. "Flight 447, you are not appearing on radar. Please confirm your position." "We don't have a position," Morrison shouted. "The GPS shows coordinates that don't exist. We're flying through, I don't know what we're flying through." The humming suddenly stopped, replaced by perfect silence. Then, impossibly, Sarah heard her own voice coming through the headphones. "Find anything yet?" It was the exact phrase she'd spoken to Marcus in the forest 3 days ago. But that was impossible. The recording was from the night of the crash, and she hadn't even been assigned to the case until… "Dr. Chen!" David was banging on the glass now. "You need to see this." She looked up to find David pointing at the monitor displaying the black box's current status. The device was active, recording new data, despite being disconnected from any aircraft systems. The readout showed they were currently in flight at 35,000 feet, traveling at 500 knots, with 89 souls on board. Sarah tore off her headphones, but she could still hear the recording playing, not from the speakers, but from inside the black box itself. Morrison's voice echoed from within the device, as if he were trapped inside. "The passengers are starting to move now," came the captain's terrified whisper. "But they're moving wrong. Their heads are turning all the way around, and they're all looking at us. All 89 of them, just staring at the cockpit with these empty, dead eyes." The black box began to vibrate on the examination table, and Sarah noticed frost forming on its surface despite the room's constant temperature. She backed toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. Through the glass partition, she could see David frantically working at his computer, but his movements seemed sluggish, as if he were underwater. "Dr. Chen?" Morrison's voice called from the black box, but he was speaking directly to her now, not to his co-pilot. "You need to listen very carefully. The crash hasn't happened yet. It's still happening. It will always be happening. And now that you've heard the recording?" The lights flickered, and in the strobing illumination, Sarah saw them. 89 passengers standing in her examination room, their heads twisted at impossible angles, all staring at her with Morrison's terrified eyes. "Welcome aboard Flight 447, they said in unison, their voices harmonizing with that terrible humming. "Please take your seat. We are beginning our descent." The black box cracked open like an egg, and inside, instead of recording equipment, Sarah saw the interior of an airplane cabin stretching impossibly deep into darkness. Sarah found herself sitting in seat 14A, her hands gripping armrests that felt ice cold despite the cabin's stifling warmth. The examination room was gone. The NTSB facility was gone. She was aboard Flight 447, and according to the digital display above her head, they were cruising at 35,000 feet with 2 hours and 17 minutes remaining to their destination. But that couldn't be right. Flight 447 had crashed 3 days ago. She'd walked through the wreckage herself, collected the pieces, held the twisted metal in her hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom, but something was wrong with the tone. It sounded hollow, like an echo of an echo. "We're experiencing some minor turbulence. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." Sarah looked around the cabin. Every seat was occupied, just as Morrison had described in the recording. 89 passengers, all completely still, their eyes wide open and staring straight ahead. A businessman in the aisle seat had his laptop open, his fingers poised over the keyboard, but he wasn't typing. A mother across from her held a bottle to her infant's mouth, but the baby wasn't drinking. They were all frozen in time, like mannequins arranged in a grotesque tableau. "Excuse me," Sarah whispered to the businessman. He didn't respond. She reached out to touch his arm and gasped. His skin was ice cold, and she could see frost forming where her fingers made contact. The plane shuddered, and Sarah felt the familiar sensation of turbulence. But when she looked out the window, she saw something that made her mind reject what her eyes were telling her. They weren't flying through clouds or over landscape. They were flying through space, literal space, surrounded by stars and floating debris that looked suspiciously like pieces of aircraft. "That's not possible," she muttered, pressing her face to the small porthole. "Nothing's possible here," said a voice behind her. Sarah spun around to find Marcus sitting in the seat behind her, but it wasn't quite Marcus. His face was pale, his eyes held the same glassy stare as the other passengers, and when he spoke, frost came out with his breath. "Marcus, how did you aren't even on the plane." "None of us were on the plane, Sarah, but we're all here now. Everyone who's ever listened to the recording, everyone who's ever touched the black box, we're all passengers now." The plane lurched again, more violently this time. Through the intercom, Morrison's voice returned, but now it sounded panicked. "Flight control, we have a problem. Our instruments are showing impossible readings. We appear to be flying through the wreckage of our own aircraft." Sarah looked out the window again. Morrison was right. Scattered among the stars were pieces of Flight 447, the same twisted metal fragments she'd collected in Montana. They were flying through the debris field of their own crash, somehow existing in the same space as their destruction. "This is the loop," Marcus explained, his voice unnaturally calm. "The plane crashes, but it never stops flying. The passengers die, but they never stop living. The recording plays, but it never stops recording. And everyone who investigates becomes part of the investigation." The plane lurched again, more violently this time. Through the intercom, Morrison's voice returned, but now it sounded panicked. "Flight control, we have a problem. Our instruments are showing impossible readings. We appear to be We appear to be flying through the wreckage of our own aircraft." Sarah looked out the window again. Morrison was right. Scattered among the stars were pieces of Flight 447, the same twisted metal fragments she'd collected in Montana. They were flying through the debris field of their own crash, somehow existing in the same space as their destruction. "This is the loop," Marcus explained, his voice unnaturally calm. "The plane crashes, but it never stops flying. The passengers die, but they never stop living. The recording plays, but it never stops recording. And everyone who investigates becomes part of the investigation." "That's impossible! This violates every law of physics, every principle of—" "Physics doesn't apply here, Dr. Chen. This is somewhere else, somewhere between the moment of impact and the moment of silence. We exist in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between words. We are the explanation for the unexplainable." The cabin lights began to flicker, and Sarah noticed that the frozen passengers were starting to move. Slowly, mechanically, they turned their heads to look at her. 89 pairs of dead eyes focusing on the newest addition to their eternal flight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison's voice crackled again, "we're beginning our descent into— I don't know where we're descending into. The altimeter shows we're going down, but we're also going up. We're moving forward, but we're also going backward. Time isn't working properly." Through the intercom, Sarah could hear Williams crying. "The ground is coming up to meet us, but it's also falling away. We're crashing, but we're also taking off. We're dying, but we're also being born." The plane shuddered again, and Sarah felt the unmistakable sensation of falling. But when she looked out the window, she saw they were also climbing, the stars growing brighter and closer. They were ascending and descending simultaneously, caught in an impossible paradox. "Your seat, Dr. Chen," said the businessman, his head rotating 180 degrees to face her while his body remained forward. "You need to take your seat for the crash." All 89 passengers were moving now, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by a drunk puppeteer. They began to chant in unison, their voices creating that terrible humming sound Sarah had first heard in the forest. "We are the black box. We are the record of what cannot be recorded. We are the explanation of what cannot be explained. We are the survivors of what cannot be survived." The plane pitched forward into a dive, and through the intercom, Morrison screamed, "We're going down! We're going down, but we're also going up! We're everywhere! We're everywhen!" Sarah felt herself pressed back into her seat as they fell upward into the stars, and she realized with growing horror that she could see the ground below them, the Montana forest where she'd found the wreckage. They were crashing into the same place they'd taken off from, in a loop that had no beginning and no end. "Welcome to eternity, Dr. Chen," Marcus whispered, as the plane broke apart around them while somehow remaining perfectly intact. "Population, everyone who ever wondered what really happened to Flight 447. The last thing Sarah saw before the crash that never ended was her own face, reflected in the black box's orange surface, staring back at herself with the same dead, glassy eyes as all the other passengers. Sarah woke up in her bed, gasping and drenched in sweat. The familiar weight of her apartment pressed around her, the same beige walls, the same clutter of aviation manuals on her nightstand, the same digital clock showing 3:33 a.m. in angry red digits. It had been a dream, a horrible, vivid nightmare brought on by 3 days of examining that cursed black box. She laughed shakily, running her hands through her hair. Of course it was a dream. Planes didn't fly through space. Passengers didn't freeze in time. She was an NTSB investigator, not a horror movie protagonist. But when she reached for her phone to check messages, she found something that made her blood turn to ice. A boarding pass for Flight 447, Seat 14A, dated for tonight's departure. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her hands were shaking as she examined the ticket. It looked real, felt real, even had her name printed in the passenger field. But Flight 447 had crashed 3 days ago. There was no Flight 447 anymore. She stumbled to her laptop, desperate to prove her own sanity. The airline's website showed Flight 447 departing Denver at 11:30 p.m., arriving in Seattle at 1:47 a.m. Currently scheduled and on time. According to every database she could access, Flight 447 had never crashed. The wreckage in Montana didn't exist. The black box sitting in her lab was just her imagination. But Sarah remembered the taste of airplane air, the feeling of those ice-cold armrests, the terror in Morrison's voice as he described impossible instrument readings. She remembered Marcus sitting behind her with frost on his breath, telling her about the loop. She called the NTSB facility. No answer. She called Marcus's cell phone. Disconnected. She called David, her assistant. The number belonged to a pizza restaurant. With growing panic, Sarah checked her employment records. According to every system she accessed, she'd never worked for the NTSB. Her degree was in art history, not aviation safety. Her apartment lease showed she'd been a freelance graphic designer for the past 5 years. The boarding pass in her hand remained stubbornly real. Sarah tried to leave her apartment, but the door wouldn't budge. She tried the windows, but they were sealed shut. Her phone showed no signal. Her internet connection died. The walls seemed to be moving closer together, but when she looked directly at them, they snapped back into place. At 11:15 p.m., she heard the sound of jet engines outside her window. Despite being on the 14th floor of a downtown apartment building, Flight 447 was hovering outside her bedroom, its lights casting eerie shadows through her blinds. The boarding stairs were extended, leading from her window directly into the aircraft's cabin. "Dr. Chen," came Morrison's voice through her apartment's intercom system, "this is your final boarding call." She had no choice. The apartment was collapsing around her, reality folding in on itself like origami made of time and space. Sarah stepped through her window onto the boarding stairs and immediately felt the familiar chill of recycled airplane air. Inside the cabin, the other 89 passengers were waiting for her, but this time they were different. This time she recognized some of them. There was David, her assistant who apparently had never existed. There was Jenkins from the NTSB, who, according to reality, had never been her colleague. There was her own mother, who had died in a car crash when Sarah was 12. But Sarah clearly remembered her mother dying in a plane crash, investigating Flight 447. "Everyone who touches the black box," Marcus explained from his usual seat behind her. "Everyone who hears the recording. Everyone who tries to solve the mystery becomes part of the mystery." Sarah took her seat in 14A, and this time she understood. The black box wasn't a recording device, it was a trap. It captured not just the final moments of the doomed flight, but the final moments of everyone who tried to understand those moments. Every investigator, every technician, every curious soul who wondered what really happened to Flight 447 became a passenger on its eternal journey. "But why?" Sarah asked as the plane began its impossible takeoff into the space between spaces. "Because some accidents can't be explained," Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom. "Some mysteries are too big for reality to contain. So they create their own reality, their own rules, their own physics. Flight 447 didn't just crash, it became something else. Something that exists in the cracks between what is and what isn't." Through the window, Sarah could see other planes flying through the void, flights from different decades, different centuries, maybe different realities entirely. All of them filled with investigators who had become the investigated, searchers who had become the searched for. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison announced, "we are beginning our eternal descent. Please ensure your seatbacks and tray tables are in their upright positions. In the event of an emergency, your life vest is located under your seat, though I should mention that in our particular case, the emergency is permanent and life vests are largely philosophical." The plane shuddered into its familiar dive, and Sarah felt the terrible joy of finally understanding. They weren't victims of a crash, they were part of something larger, something that transcended the normal rules of existence. They were living proof that some questions were more important than answers, that some mysteries were meant to remain mysterious. "Flight 447 to anyone listening," Morrison's voice echoed across dimensions. "We are all passengers now. We are all investigators. We are all part of the story that has no ending." As the plane crashed upward into eternity, Sarah realized that somewhere, in some other reality, another investigator was finding a black box in a Montana forest. Another curious soul was pressing play on a recording that should not exist. Another person was about to discover that some flights never end. They just pick up new passengers. The black box hummed its terrible lullaby, recording everything and nothing, preserving the moment between life and death, between question and answer, between the crash that happened and the crash that's still happening. Flight 447 was always departing, always arriving, always crashing, always surviving. And now, so was everyone who ever wondered why. Welcome aboard! But somewhere in Montana, fresh footprints appear in the snow around twisted wreckage, and a new investigator reaches for an orange box that shouldn't exist.